Cost comparisons of fertilizer by source and application. In this video, we'll discuss fertilizer prices, factors that are affecting fertilizer prices, and then do a comparison of the cost between commercial fertilizer and poultry litter in corn production. I'm Aaron Smith. I'm an extension economist with the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics with the University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture. Just to provide a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about in this video, we'll first start out talking about fertilizer prices, where we've been, where we are right now, and factors that are affecting the increase in prices that we've seen over the last year and a half. Another important factor to consider for producers is the increased application costs with the rise in diesel fuel prices and pretty much inflation across multiple categories. The application cost can be expensive with the increased fuel, with the increased capital that's required, access to labor. Those types of issues all have implications in terms of what the cost is, or what the cost is associated if you are going to get a custom application as well. And then we'll talk quickly about the economic analysis of poultry litter on corn production and provide a summary and some of the key findings that we ended up finding in our analysis. So when we look at fertilizer and diesel prices, this is the USDA National Agriculture Statistics Service Index from 2006 until 2022. This is a monthly data set, and it allows us to kind of take a look at what costs are relative to a baseline of 2011. And we look at this, they have an estimate of fertilizer up 34.8%. This is across all categories, so we have to be careful with the interpretation of this. And then diesel fuel up 65.5% compared to last year. When we actually look at some of our key sources of fertilizer, we've got DAP, MAP, potash, and urea on this graph, and you can see where we're estimated as of the first week in June, where we have seen prices rise dramatically over the last year and a half, where they've doubled or in some cases tripled in price. But we have, and I'll use urea as kind of to highlight this, we have seen prices start to come down a little bit. Now, again, we have to be cautious with this because there's still a tremendous amount of uncertainty in fertilizer markets. And so, again, we do have to be careful with what our expectations are, both in the present and in the future for prices. But we are in a very high price environment when you look at as we planted this crop in particular, the 2022 crop. We did have substantially higher fertilizer prices that we did incorporate into our production costs. When we look at other fertilizers, this one has anhydrous and then UAN, and we see a very similar pattern where we're up tremendously from where we are, but maybe we're leveling off or coming down a little bit as we enter June. We'll have to see as we progress through the summer what the direction is in fertilizer prices. So when we look at factors that are influencing fertilizer and fuel prices, obviously inflation is a very important topic right now when we talk about the general economy, but also in the agriculture economy. The latest inflation number that was released was 8.6%, the highest in 40 years when you look at May of 2022. And so that's something that's elevating prices for all of our inputs. There is still some implications that are left over from last year's hurricane season, where we've seen disruption in U.S. production, although that's kind of been alleviated somewhat by getting back our production capacity. But there is still kind of maybe a bit of a hangover, you could call it, on that. And then we look at constrained foreign production, trying to reduce some of their fertilizer exports, and that obviously tightens global supplies for those countries that are looking to import it. We do have tariffs that have been in place in Morocco and Russia that do have potential implications for what producers are paying. And then again, supply chain and global logistic issues as a result of COVID-19 continue to affect all markets, and fertilizers no exception to that. And so as we look at the movement of goods, that's going to continue to be an important factor. And then obviously, anytime you're moving goods, we're going to be using energy. And so the longer we keep higher periods of energy prices, the more that's going to continue to prevail in agricultural inputs. When we look at one of the primary reasons for these high fertilizer prices, we have very high commodity prices. And when we have high commodity prices, there's very strong demand. This isn't just in the US, this is globally. So when we look at wheat prices and corn prices where they are right now, there's a tremendous demand globally for nutrients to make sure that we can get the maximum amount of production for the prices that we've got prevailing right now in the markets, which look very attractive relative to where we have been in the recent past. The other one that was a major influence in fertilizer markets was Ukraine, Russia. Obviously, Russia is a major producer of some of our key fertilizers. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then we do have the energy implications, which is tied to Russia, Ukraine as well. But we do have higher oil and natural gas prices. So we look at natural gas prices just to kind of put it into context. From 2016 to 2020, average price for natural gas was 2.66. And when we look at June 10th, 8.95. So again, substantial increase in the cost of energy, natural gas, which is a key input in the production of nitrogen. When we look at a study that was put out by Texas A&M, it's a few months old, but it still holds reasonably true, where we've got natural gas accounting for 70 to 90% of the variable production costs of nitrogen fertilizer. However, when we look at that increase in fertilizer prices, the A&M study came out and said that they could only attach about 15% of the increase in nitrogen fertilizer costs to the rise in natural gas. So that list of other factors that were affecting fertilizer prices obviously plays a huge role in it. So again, it's very difficult when we go through those 5 to 10 items that are really impacting fertilizer prices. What percentage of these increased prices can be affiliated with each one of those factors? And so when we look at this, we kind of look at kind of the aggregate result, where we're 2 to 3 times higher on average when we look at fertilizer prices. I did mention Russia. It is a major producer of energy and fertilizer. So when we look at things like ammonia, Russia 11%. When we look at potash, 19%, and urea, and 14%. So again, implications there are that Russia isn't exporting as much as they were, or aren't exporting to Western countries. That does have implications in the price of fertilizer and the price of energy that is used to end up producing and transporting fertilizer. One other one that's been incredibly challenging for a lot of producers and for those that do custom work is trying to incorporate the inflationary pressures into their machinery rates or your machinery costs. And so I took a quick, just basic example. If your application cost for fertilizer was $12.25 per acre back in 2021, you look at the portion of those total expenses across capital recovery, and then taxes, insurance, and housing, and fuel, and repair and maintenance, and then labor. And so again, when you look at these cost items, 20% of that cost is fuel, and so you get an equivalent based on last year. However, we all know prices are substantially higher. And so what I did was I took the CPI to end up adjusting these individual categories to get kind of an aggregate. And so again, when we look at things like fuel, that was up 48.7% compared to the previous 12 months, that's going to end up having a higher increase than some of the categories that maybe had a lower increase. But when you kind of do a weighted average, you get about 20% increase year over year in the cost to end up putting out the fertilizer. And you can do this for different implements. We have a little spreadsheet that allows you to do basic cost increases relative to the previous year based on the inflation adjusted amounts for individual categories. So I do want to kind of step into the kind of, I guess, the main part of our analysis here, and we're looking at poultry litter relative to commercial fertilizers. So we look at some factors that need to be considered right off the top for poultry litter is poultry litter availability. Obviously, nutrients are in high demand. There are certain areas of Tennessee that will have easier access to poultry litter. There will be times of the year when it's in incredibly high demand, and so there's going to be accessibility issues. It's not just something where if you're running out to grab it that you're going to be able to get all that you need, but it is something worth looking at and seeing, okay, can I get access to poultry litter? And then the second question to that, okay, I can get access, is it cost effective, and how far can I end up moving that? So, having an idea of what those transportation costs are for an individual operation is something that's very important. Another one that's really important is making sure that poultry litter is tested. There's several studies out there. I've seen one from Kentucky and Mississippi State as well that show the variability. And so again, when you're looking at the variability, you want to know what the nutrients are that are being applied to the field. So it just necessitates that testing to try to take some of that guesswork out in terms of knowing what's in there and what's going to be available. That's another big one, is what are the nutrients that are available to the crop when they are needed. We don't look in this analysis at some of the other nutrients. We're just going to kind of stick to N, P, and K. But there are other nutrients that can be beneficial. And then there are additional implications for organic matter and long-term soil health. And I'll always defer to our soil scientists as to looking at what those benefits are and trying to quantify those long-term benefits. So when we look at kind of the assumptions in our analysis, we used University of Kentucky study where they had an average for a ton of poultry litter at 50 pounds of N, with only half of that available, and then P at 45 pounds and K at 47 pounds. But again, one of the things that the study really does highlight is there's some variability there that we want to make sure that we're accounting for and making sure we're testing. And then we're comparing that to the average commercial fertilizer price from January to June. Obviously, that's a pretty wide window, but since prices have fluctuated so much and been volatile, but increasing over time, we wanted to kind of look at that time period where producers were getting ready to plant, and then obviously enter into the production year and see where those prices were on average. So we use prices for urea of $9.55 a ton, which goes to $1.04 per pound of N, DAP at $9.66 per ton, potash at $8.45, and then UAN at $7.11 per ton, or $711 per ton. So what we ended up doing is we looked at the partial returns of poultry litter combined with a commercial nitrogen application compared to just a commercial application of N, P, and K. And we did kind of a high fertility estimate, and then we did a lower fertility. So this is a higher one where we're doing 210, or a target of 210 pounds of N, 80 of P and K. And what this shows is it shows the low cost per ton. And so the way to read this graph is that we have the price of poultry litter on the horizontal axis ranging from $20 to $100, and then what the difference in net returns was between poultry litter applied prior to planting and then following up with a nitrogen application in season versus just doing a straight commercial nitrogen application in a split when we look at initial and then another one during the production year. And what we found is a couple of different things. Obviously, the low cost per ton of litter was more supported for higher application rates. So we can see the different application rates of poultry litter that we have on the bottom, ranging from 5 down to 0.5. And so at $20 per ton, what we ended up seeing is, putting 5 tons per acre was the most cost effective. But as you've seen, poultry litter prices increased to 30, what we've seen was a pullback on that rate. And a lot of that is you're fulfilling the N, P, and K requirements and having surplus that's available. And then you end up just applying for N in terms of use at that point. And so kind of the way to illustrate this is we this is a table depiction of the previous chart. But what we looked at was, okay, well, what's the maximum, or what's the partial returns based under the different tons per acre and the different prices of poultry litter. And the cell that's highlighted in bright yellow is the highest net return for that particularly poultry litter price. And then these light yellow ones would be the ones that wasn't statistically significantly different from the optimal. And so when we look at this, you can see as we have a low cost for poultry litter from 20 to 30 ton, or $20 to $30 per ton. What you see is there's not a huge amount of difference when we put on a higher amount in terms of what the partial net returns are going to end up being. And when we look at, okay, as price ends up increasing, that ends up tightening up that range and ends up reducing it down to about 2 tons per acre of poultry litter. Is where we're looking at getting those higher partial net returns. As we get even higher than that, into that 60 to 80 range, that's when we end up seeing maybe 1.5 tons per acre as the optimal. Anything that's highlighted in red shows commercial fertilizer prices under those circumstances providing a higher net return than what poultry litter and a combination of an additional N application would end up being. And so when we look at the next slide, we look at a lower fertility requirement. And what we see again is a very similar pattern, but we end up seeing with the lower fertility that we do end up seeing the returns end up going towards the smaller application rates a little bit earlier on when we end up having the price per ton of poultry litter. So again, graphically, when we end up looking at this, you compare the two tables and see where those optimals are. But again, the way to read this is if we had a price of poultry litter of $30 per ton, 1.5 tons per acre would be $77.25 per acre, more beneficial than or cheaper than an NP and K application from commercial sources. And so, obviously the high prices hopefully are not here to stay for commercial fertilizers. So we're looking at, okay, well, what is the implications if commercial fertilizer prices drop by a third? And we do this kind of a similar analysis where we're going to do the high and then the lower side. And what you end up seeing is you do end up seeing a pullback on when it is cost effective in terms of the prices for poultry litter when their application is more beneficial. And so again, you start looking at $40–50 a ton at a lower application rate. Anything greater than that in terms of price, then you start seeing a greater benefit for commercial NP and K. But again, you also see at $20 to $30 a ton, incorporating it in as a substitute, or not a substitute, a complementary product, because we're not getting all of our end requirements out of poultry litter and corn. We're going to have to end up using it as part of a system to end up meeting the nutrient requirements. And then when we look at this again, what we see is at those lower costs, there's you can get some benefit when we're down at 2 tons per acre, but again, you can end up applying more and receiving, a similar partial net return. But what we do end up seeing as the price of commercial fertilizers comes down, it does increase its competitiveness with poultry litter. And it does maybe drop us down to maybe we should be doing about 1 to 2.5 tons per acre in several circumstances. When we look at the lower fertility requirements, again, it's just amplified that we're looking at kind of that $20–30 per ton is kind of where we need to end up targeting. So just to kind of summarize the finds that we're seeing, I think poultry litter can be a very cost-effective complement to commercial fertilizer in corn production. Obviously, making sure that we have access to it and we get it tested is one of the big concerns. What we found with under the current fertilizer prices and the current poultry litter prices between $40 and $50 a ton, 1 to 3 tons per acre with supplemental nitrogen resulted in the higher partial returns. If fertilizer prices drop by a third and poultry litter prices are between $20 and $40 a ton, then it might decrease down to 1 to 2.5 tons per acre, with supplemental nitrogen to be used in season to end up making sure that we get the appropriate levels of nitrogen to the corn crop. This is obviously restricted by access and distance to poultry litter and the nutrient variability that is in there. If we deviate from that standard kind of 3-3-2 proportion, that's why it's so important to get it tested, because some of the results from the studies that have been conducted do highlight that variability. When we look at fertilizer prices in general, I think they've started to creep down in most areas, but there still remains a great deal of price uncertainty for 2022 and 23. There can be a lot changing. There's so many different things that are going on in terms of inflation, in terms of interest rates, in terms of geopolitical instability because of Ukraine and Russia. And then obviously with the high commodity prices, there's going to be a strong demand pull as we move through the rest of this production year and into next year. So it seems unlikely that we'll see a return back to the spring 2021 levels, but hopefully we'll see some moderation in the prices of commercial fertilizers. With that, I thank you for watching the video. And if you do want to ask any questions or have access to one of these tools, please reach out to me directly and I'd be happy to assist you.